and which indeed may result in products being created which could have job creation opportunities, and indeed just ensure the sophistication of what's happening down there and in the college down there is something I think to be proud of. The Deputy can be assured that I'm extremely supportive of everything that's happening there, as is government, and I very much welcomed the visit that the Justice and Defence Committee paid to Hull Boland. I think it gave a very interesting insight into the innovation that's taking place, and I would certainly encourage members of the House who are interested in these areas to pay a similar visit.
Deputy McLaughlin, is that okay? Thank you both. Questions 6 and 18 together, I think, Minister, is that right?
Just caught up with ourselves. I propose to take questions 6 and 18 together. Since 1998, a total of 14 barracks have been closed under various barrack consolidation programmes. To date, 9 of these barracks, Clancy in Dublin, Castleblaney, Ballincollig, Fermoy, Naas, Monaghan, Cavan, Castlebar, and a large portion of Longford have been sold. In relation to the remaining barracks, agreement has been reached for the sale of Lifford and Rockhill to Donegal County Council. Discussions are ongoing in relation to the possible sale of Clonmel Barracks, and the remaining part of Longford has been reserved for the Office of Public Works for a local Garda station. McGee Barracks in Kildare and Colin Barracks in Mullingar remain the property of the Department. All remaining vacated barracks, as well as any properties identified as surplus to military requirements, will be disposed of by my department, taking account of the market conditions, so as to maximise the return to the Defence Forces.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Farrell.
What have I got 2 minutes?
We now have 8 minutes actually for the overall questions and answers, and others may also join in the questioning.
Right. Well, look, I want to thank the Minister for that response. 2 critical pieces of property exist here in Colin Barracks in Mullingar, and a piece of ground with which I have particular affinity and concern, the whole area of McGee Barracks in Kildare. I think what is important about these 2 pieces of property is their strategic locations in respect of the 2 significant towns where they're located. To see the Colin Barracks in Mullingar developed for employment generating process is something that I think we would all share, and we would urge the Minister to continue with whatever initiatives that you have in mind there. Great local dissatisfaction exists in County Kildare at the fact that the 65 acres of McGee Barracks, which is located centrally within the town, remains undeveloped, and indeed, far from being undeveloped, has become a focus for ongoing antisocial behaviour. Now, one accepts, Minister, that to come up with a plan for the strategic development of 65 acres of land in a town the size of Kildare, in the current climate, is indeed a major challenge. So can I ask the Minister, to what extent has his officials been engaging with Enterprise Ireland, IDA, the local authorities and other state bodies? And can I again raise with him a question in relation...
I'd like to let him answer that, and you can come back again, because the questions should be limited to 1 minute, so there's a conversation. Okay?
Thanks for your guidance.
Thanks.
Well, firstly, I would like to say to the Deputy, I would be an enthusiast for the disposal of both barracks if there was an appropriate proposal made in that regard. There's of course been a long history of engagement with state agencies regarding to McGee Barracks since its closure in 1998. In 1999, at the request of the Department of Foreign Affairs, part of the site was made available for use as a temporary accommodation for some 265 Kosovo refugees. The year 2000, at the request of the Registration and Integration Agency of the Department of Justice, part of the site was made available for use as a temporary accommodation for asylum seekers. In late 2000, at the request of Kildare County Council, part of the site was made available for use as a temporary halting site for members of the travelling community. In July 2003, the then government decided that the former barracks would be among the state lands released for inclusion in the Sustaining Progress Affordable Housing Initiative. On foot of this announcement, Kildare County Council prepared a local area plan for the site, which encompassed a range of uses, including community activities. The department had been involved in the process of transferring ownership to Kildare County Council. The final contract for sale was sent to solicitors for the council in 2009. However, the local authority subsequently contacted the department to state it no longer wished to proceed with the development, had no interest in taking possession of the property. So the property was then returned to the Department of Defence in its entirety. The question of putting the property up for auction is being actively considered at present. In relation to Mullingar, some discussions have taken place with potential buyers from the state sector. However, no firm interest has been shown at this time. I can say to the Deputy that when I became Minister, there were particular problems with the site in Kildare, which was being accessed, and there were difficulties with regard to parts of the property which were in a dilapidated condition. I think it's regrettable that what is a very major site was left really for over a decade vacant, used for a variety of purposes, with no direct plan being put in place for its development. In the current economic climate, it's obviously a matter of great difficulty in dealing with this, but I would very much welcome a re-engagement by Kildare County Council. For example, in Clonmel, the local authorities have come together with my department, and there's been a very substantial engagement with a view to putting together a plan for the future use of Clonmel Barracks. I very much welcome Kildare County Council showing a similar interest in this particular site and its potential, with a view to some practical arrangements being put in place.
Thank you, Minister. I got a little untidy there. Any supplementary questions?
I would just very briefly, I want to acknowledge the Minister's role in securing the site, although it continues to be breached, unfortunately. But I know your department incurred significant expenditure in attempting to secure the site. I deplore the fact that Kildare County Council did not achieve ownership of the site when it was offered to them in 2009. That's an absolute disgrace that the local authority did not proceed at that time. But can I put it to you that, given that you are now the owner on behalf of the Irish people, that it is incumbent on you to be perhaps proactive in this particular matter? And I would suggest that, yes, Kildare County Council has a role, but so too has the Minister for the Environment, and so too has the Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment. Because gone are the days when we want to see this site developed for affordable housing. That's certainly a dead duck as a proposition, and it's not one I was ever wildly enthusiastic about. But it is a site that has huge potential in terms of job creation and perhaps recreation and amenity facilities, as indeed it has for some educational facilities. And I think you do have a role, Minister, and I would call on you to be proactive in engaging with your ministerial colleagues on the matter.
Thank you. That was the perfect minute.
Can I say to the Deputy, I think it's a very important site with great potential. And I think it's unfortunate that that potential hasn't been realised more actively. The reality is, since I've become Minister, my department has done everything possible with regard to the various vacant sites by circulating state agencies to government departments, making it known that sites are available. In relation to the site in Kildare, this has been known for a very long time. The Deputy's party was in government for the major portion of the time when this site was vacant, and didn't succeed in doing anything other than having it used for temporary purposes, and effecting what I could describe as a degradation of the site because of the different purposes it was designated for, and ultimately arrangements that were envisaged to be implemented with Kildare County Council never came to pass. But I would very much like to see something happen in relation to Mullingar. We have done in relation to Mullingar taken similar steps to the steps we took in Clonmel and the steps we took in Cavan, where Cavan Barracks, when it was closed, is now taken over by the local VEC, and who are already functioning there. But unfortunately, the similar interest wasn't shown in Mullingar either.
Thank you.
And again, I'd encourage the local community to look at, and the local council to look at, possible uses for what is a very historical barracks on a very important site. There are, of course, some limitations on how it can be used because some of the buildings are designated buildings, but it should not be impossible, with an active engagement, to identify appropriate uses.
Thank you.
It's not something the Department of Defence can do on its own, by itself, and my department doesn't have a role in developing these sites.
Thank you. Right, we'll move on to the next grouping of questions. I believe questions 7 and 25 taken together.
Yes, I'm taking questions 7 and 25 together, Cathaoirleach. The primary responsibility, of course, for the maintenance of law and order rests with An Garda Síochána. The Defence Forces, pursuant to their role of rendering aid to the civil power, assist An Garda Síochána when requested to do so. The Defence Forces, in conjunction with An Garda Síochána, keep the threat level under continual review. There has been no request from An Garda Síochána for additional assistance, such as would warrant a general increase in the level of Defence Force personnel deployed in the border regions. In my capacity as Minister for Justice and Equality, I would like to ensure deputies that resources will not be an issue, and every effort is being made by An Garda Síochána to bring to justice the perpetrators of the most heinous crime that resulted in the very callous and barbaric murder of Detective Garda Adrian Donoghue. But until the Garda, as I say, the Garda Síochána have not indicated that there is a need for an engagement by the Defence Forces in the manner that the Deputy is suggesting, and it is a matter ultimately for the Garda authorities.
Thank you, Minister. 1 minute questions.
Well, I'd be very
answers.
brief.
Yeah.
And I don't think I need any further time on this particular matter, but just to ask the Minister to keep the matter under continuous review. I mean, we're all very conscious of the activity of criminal gangs along the border. We're aware that some of these describe themselves as dissident Republicans. We know they're criminals. We know their activities are particularly nefarious, and should the need arise for the military to be involved in supporting the civil powers, I think it's important that they could respond quickly. There is a level of disappointment along the border region that we now have no military presence between Finnarcamp and Dundalk, and there's a lot of disappointment that the Minister would be aware of at the closure of the very modern and well-equipped Dail in Cavan. But I think it will take the Minister's assurance that should the need arise, that the necessary military participation and involvement will be available.
Thank you, Deputy.
Give the Deputy that assurance.
That's fantastic. We'll move now on to the next question. Question number 8, Minister. Thank you.
I have, I think, a large number of questions altogether, 8, 10, 14, 20, 21, 27 and 36, which I propose to take together. They all deal with the issue of Mali that we dealt with earlier. For some reason it says 8 and 10, but I seem to have number 9. Number 9 I'm taking.
To ask the Minister for
taking
Defence
separately, because number 9 deals with EU battle groups, which has absolutely nothing to do with the issue of Mali, as I would have thought the Deputy might know. I addressed the question of possible Defence Force participation in the EU training mission for Mali in answering the priority question earlier. Fourth generation for the new mission, which was established by the Council of the European Union 17th of January 2013, is currently ongoing at EU level. All Member States have been invited by the mission commander to provide contributions to the mission. While Ireland is positively disposed towards the mission, no decision has been made at this stage as to whether Ireland will participate in the mission. A number of important factors are under consideration, such as participants, potential partners, and most importantly, how the issue of force protection, medical services and medevac will be addressed in Mali. A detailed threat assessment by the Defence Forces will be required. Discussions with partners and the EU on Ireland's possible contribution to the mission are expected to be concluded shortly. Any participation by Ireland to this mission would most likely be limited, as I said earlier, to a small contribution of trainers and would be subject to government approval.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Farrell, first.
I'll give other members a bit of time on this, obviously, but Minister, you're assuring us then if participation is to happen, it will be in the area of training rather than in the area of force protection. Number 1. And number 2, given that the mission here is really about teaching the Malian Defence Force members to respect human rights, do you see particular challenges arising from a particular from a participation in this particular mission, were it to be agreed by government and by the Houses?
Thank you, Minister.
Well, in the context of what I said earlier, I think we're now past the days when individuals are simply deployed on UN peace missions to train forces without taking what I would describe as a comprehensive approach in dealing with issues relating to the protection of civilians in conflict, the protection of human rights. That's a very crucial and essential part of missions, because it's now widely recognised that it's very important that these issues are properly addressed. So I can assure the Deputy, firstly, as I said earlier, that in the context of our possible participation, that the numbers will be small, but if we do participate, we'll be contributing in providing trainers and in the context of an overall mission whose objective goes beyond what I describe as simple military training, but which extends into other areas, which in particular deals with the protection of civilians in conflict zones, the protection of human rights, the importance of human rights, and the importance, if I could emphasise it, in not violating human rights.
Thank you. Deputy McWallace.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Minister, given the total lack of democracy in Mali at the moment and the ongoing discrimination and human rights abuses against Tuareg people in the North Mali, do you think it's appropriate for Ireland to be interfering? Should not a small independent country like ourselves stay neutral and not send troops to support one side in a civil war, which is pretty unlikely to be confined to Mali? Now, the French have been very eager to move in, but surely I'm not so sure we should be supporting this either. France is probably the last country to sort out Mali's problems, having created quite a few of them in the first place as a former colonial power. The French may have been invited in by the Malian government, but it's a government brought to power by military coup last year, not one elected by the Malians, and whose troops are now trading atrocities and human rights abuses with the rebels. And I have no intention of standing up for the rebels either, but I would like to see us stay neutral and out.
Minister.
Well, firstly, I draw the Deputy's attention to what I said earlier, which is that our UN resolutions to provide for a mission, a UN mission, which it is, to train the domestic Malian forces so that they're fit for purpose, able to carry out their duties, and able to effectively protect that population. It's not the role of Ireland to make decisions or engage in matters that relate to the particular government in an individual country, but the Deputy's concept of neutrality I find interesting, because I'm not sure what the moral platform is that one stands on by just standing back and watching people being brutalised, their arms being cut off, women being raped, as has happened in northern Mali, women being discriminated against and treated as second-class citizens, while fundamentalists impose Sharia law and try to turn the population somewhere back to the 7th or 8th century, though I think in the 7th and 8th century there was a more humane version of Islam than the form of Islam that Sharia law seeks in its strictest and fundamentalist terms to impose on populations. So I see this as a human rights issue. I see it as a neutral state participating, should we participate, and as I said, that's not finalised, a neutral state participating in a UN-sanctioned mission whose objective is to ensure that human life is protected, that individuals aren't victims of atrocities. I don't have any respect for a concept of morality which says you stand back and watch people being killed, you stand back and watch their limbs being chopped off, you stand back and watch women being raped, and then pat yourself on the back and say you're morally superior because you simply watched it.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Wallace, I know Deputy Lloyd
Minister, I am not talking about moral superiority, and I do not approve of any of the violence on behalf of the jihad rebels at all. But I'm probably less. I am very much not a fan of war of any type. We've just seen Afghanistan has been a disaster, Iraq has been a disaster, and I just feel that when there is military intervention from outside forces, I actually think that the problems are exacerbated. And the past decade, Minister, has demonstrated beyond doubt that such interventions don't necessarily solve crises, let alone deal with the causes of terrorism, but deepen them and generate new conflicts. more military interventions will bolster authoritarian regimes, and its rhetoric further poison community relations in the intervening states. And it seems to be a price that we've paid over and over for. And I mean, too often, I just think that if the Africans were let to solve their problems, I think the death toll will be less at the end of the day.
Thank you. Minister, a minute.
Well, I would have to say to the Deputy, he seems to be of the view that when there's a UN-mandated mission, this state shouldn't participate. This state has a very honoured tradition in participating in missions of peacekeeping nature, missions that can contribute to conflict resolution, missions that can contribute to the protection of civilian life. I think it's particularly interesting that the Deputy fails to make any reference to the UN mandate. I don't know, does the Deputy believe that our defence forces should ever participate in peacekeeping missions, or whether we should simply play no role in the outside world at all and never seek to provide any assistance to anyone? It's not only is this a UN mission, but all of the European Union countries, all 27, all of which are democracies, have looked at what's happening in Mali and recognised the need to contribute to the UN mission and to engage to try and provide the type of training necessary to ensure that the Malian army is properly trained, that it doesn't engage in human rights abuses, and that civilians are protected. I believe that we should give careful consideration as to whether we participate in this mission. As I said, no final decision has been made, but on the basis of the approach taken by the Deputy, we would participate in no UN missions in any location in the world, because the reality is the only parts of the world which require UN peacekeeping or conflict resolution engagements are troubled parts of the world where, sadly and tragically, there is and has been violence, where lives have been lost, and the purpose of a UN mission is to seek to facilitate addressing that particular difficulty.
Thank you. Deputy Wallace, just very briefly, and then Deputy Boyd Barrett has a
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Minister, I'm all for keeping the peace, right? But I think we're seeing a growing militarised European Union, and the production of arms and export of arms is growing in Europe, and they're becoming very dependent upon them. And too often, not always, but sometimes, countries are making decisions which actually promote their own arms industries, and that's really worrying.
Minister.
Well, if I can say to the Deputy that we had an interesting conference in Dublin last week, and one of the participants was from the African Union, and there's a general recognition that there are great difficulties in Mali, and there's a need to provide assistance in Mali to protect individuals. And insofar as the Deputy seems to think has some sort of odd view about the European Union becoming increasingly militarised, at a time when every European Union state is spending less on its defence forces than was the case in previous years, at a time when every union, practically every European Union state is reducing the numbers within its defence forces, at a time where the European Union member states of the United Nations are participating a great deal less in UN missions by providing troops to assist in UN missions. The reality is that far greater participation in UN missions in Africa by African states, and indeed by states in other parts of the world. So the Deputy, I'm afraid, isn't speaking from a position of knowledge. He's speaking from a position of presumption and perception, which the facts don't bear out. And at the end of the day, I come back to one very simple thing. We have a very proud record of participating in UN missions. Our defence forces do so, and wherever they go, they enhance the reputation of our defence forces and of the state. And I believe it's appropriate that we give active consideration to participating in this particular mission.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Exports are growing in Europe.
Yeah. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Minister, your narrative might almost be convincing if there was any consistency in it. When you decry human rights abuses, violence against women, and so on, inevitably attached to the word Muslim or Islamic. But where's the consistency when precisely that sort of thing carries on day in, day out in a regime like Saudi Arabia, which the European Union, the United States, and so on sell arms to week in, week out? No problem there, no military intervention there, because of course that particular brutal Islamist regime happens to serve the interests of the Western powers in the region, even when it's crushing a democratic movement in Bahrain. So that exposes the claim this is about humanity, or that these interventions are prompted by humanitarian concerns. The fact of the matter is there's a nasty civil war going on in Mali, but the Malian state and the Malian military aren't the good guys in this. The Tuareg people have legitimate national aspirations, which they've expressed in 4 different rebellions since 1960. A very impoverished, nomadic people that have suffered very badly at the hands of that rotten regime. And let's not forget that the French, who were leading the military intervention in Mali, also backed the dictatorship of Ben Ali until it was overthrown in the revolution of the people. And of course, they happen to be sitting on a lot of gold and uranium. And at the same time, there's a huge scramble going on. The United States has forces in 35 countries in Africa now. There is a scramble going on for the mineral resources of Africa as a whole, and the Islamist bogeyman is being used as a justification for military intervention. Irish troops should not be involved in a 21st century scramble for Africa.
There's 4 minutes left for interchange. Could you keep it to a minute, please, Minister?
Oh, I'd be very brief. I've absolutely no idea why the Deputy is shouting at me, and nor am I responsible for all of the conflicts that are taking place in Africa, many of which are very tragic. I'm merely dealing with the issue that was raised, which is the United Nations resolution that trainers should be provided to the Malian Armed Forces. And as I said previously, we are considering providing some small number of our defence forces to participate in that mission.
Deputy Boyd-Barrett.
The reason I'm annoyed, Minister, was because, first of all, in your initial response to my question about why number 9 wasn't grouped, you made a rather sort of disingenuous response that was about battle groups, when of course it says or military missions to Africa, and you knew precisely what it was referring to. So you're not being honest in the way you're dealing with the points that are being raised. And the point that is being raised here is this is not some sort of good guy, bad guy conflict where we can go in and say, yes, we should be training the military of the Malian state because they're somehow the good guys in this. The atrocities against the Tuareg people have substantially escalated, and I accept there's been atrocities on all sides, but have substantially escalated since the French bombardment has started, and French military intervention has started, and it is worsening the situation, and if anything, it is going to drive ordinary Malians more into the hands of the more obscurantist elements and radical elements. But it's not a simple good guy, bad guy thing. It's a nasty civil war where the French have their own agenda. And what I'm saying, Minister, is we should not be involved in this scramble that is going on by big imperial powers in African countries, because the losers will be the ordinary people of Mali and Africa generally.
There's a minute and a half left if the Minister wishes to reply.
Well, of course, as the Deputy proceeds along his ideological diatribe, what he chooses to ignore is the atrocities that were taking place in northern Mali that have been very well depicted and set out, not merely in articles, but very starkly described on our television screens, very starkly illustrate, I should say, on our television screens, where we've seen also some of the individuals who are the victims of atrocities interviewed, with their limbs missing, where we know a fundamentalist group claiming to have an Al-Qaeda link, who are also engaged in substantial criminality in the region. We're bringing individuals into stadiums and requiring spectators to come and look, and cutting off their limbs, and bringing doctors along then to provide some medication after limbs had been chopped off. Now, if the deputy thinks that the United Nations should ignore things like that, if the deputy thinks that it was in the interests of the people living in that area that they be subjected to that sort of fundamentalist atrocity, if the deputy wants to be blind to the fact that there is a problem with fundamentalist Islam, that's the deputy's choice. That is the deputy's choice. I'm dealing with the question I was asked. The question I was asked was about Mali, and I'm dealing with Mali. I'll continue to deal with Mali. The deputy wants to take a tour of every country in the world in which there are human rights issues that need to be addressed. We can do that on another occasion, but my remit as Minister for Defence this evening is to deal with the issue that was raised. Are we going to participate in a UN mission in Mali, and is such warranted? The European Union states have taken the view that a number of them, they will participate. We're giving active consideration to participating, and it's unfortunate that when the Deputy addresses areas of great international difficulty, that he always has a blind spot. And the blind spot is always in ignoring some of the atrocities committed in areas that he believes simply we should then just stand back and look at and do nothing about
Minister,
it, while the human misery is perpetrated and continues.
I'm afraid, sorry, please, members, I had a blind spot there. I missed the timing. We're moving on to number 9.
I accept, Deputy, that there are reports of that, which is a concern, and that's why trainers may be able to address that. That's the importance of human rights teaching, of dealing with people so civilians aren't brought unnecessarily into conflict. This is where the European Union, by participating in a UN mission, can make a positive contribution as opposed to sitting back and watching. Now, if I could deal,
we've got to take questions
with
9 and 10.
The next question.
9 and 30 together, I believe.
9 and 30. 2 invitations have been received by Ireland to participate in future EU battle groups. 1 invitation has been received to participate in the Nordic Battle Group 2015, together with Sweden, acting as framework nation, Finland, Norway and Estonia. The second Force Generation Conference was held in Sweden in early December 2012. The proposed contribution to this battle group will be a reconnaissance company with associated HQ staff appointments, supporting elements. The model envisaged for the battle group gives command of a multinational reconnaissance group HQ to Ireland, resulting in a raised profile. The second invitation has been received to participate in the EU Battle Group 2016, with Germany acting as framework nation. Luxembourg, Austria, Czech Republic and the Netherlands are the other participants. Discussions are ongoing with the participants on Ireland's potential contribution to this battle group. Any participation in Ireland in the Nordic 2015 and the EU Battle Group 2016 will be subject to formal government approval at the appropriate time. Separate from battle group participation, Ireland has received an invitation to participate in the European Union training mission in Mali, which will provide military training and advice to the Malian armed forces to improve their military capacity and their effectiveness in guaranteeing the country's territorial integrity. As I've already addressed the question of possible Defence Force participation in this EUTM Mali mission earlier. While Ireland, as I said previously, is positively disposed towards this mission, no decision has yet made, and if we decide any decision by way of participation will be a matter ultimately to be determined by government.
Thank you, Minister. We have 4 minutes in slots of 1 minute each, questions and answers.
Minister, I mean, maybe it was an innocent mistake on your part, because I can see the thing about the battle, but the reference was in the question to military involvement, our military involvement in Africa, although it is worth saying, and I have a question further down which we probably won't reach, that there is an alarming drift towards greater involvement in this country since your government has come in military affairs and supporting a militarist agenda, including, for example, the invitation of NATO's Deputy Assistant Secretary-General for Political Affairs and Security Policy to address a defence seminar as part of one of the first events in the EU presidency events. Not mentioned that he was actually linked to NATO, mention of the UN, mention of the EU, but in fact the guy is one of the main spokespeople for NATO. And that's indicative of the alarming closer synergy and relationship between NATO and the European Union, which is not being acknowledged because it wasn't mentioned when he was speaking. But and it's in that context that we worry about so-called humanitarian missions, which are often sold as humanitarian, but involved in those missions are states and powers, in the case of Mali, France, in Africa generally, the United States and so on, who have interests and who tend to be extremely selective in what dictatorships they're opposed to, what terrorists they're opposed to, what Islamicist extremists they find problematic, and other ones they don't find quite so problematic. And you know, it's not invention or conspiracy on our part. President Jimmy Carter's main military advisor, Foreign Secretary Brzezinski, wrote a book where he outlined in detail how the Carter administration backed the Taliban and the establishment of what later became Al-Qaeda because it suited them in the strategic battle during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. As he put it, what's stirring up a few mullahs compared to the defeat of the Soviet Empire. So the same sort of carry-on, we're putting it to you, Minister, is going on in Mali, in Africa generally, and a neutral country like Ireland should not even consider being involved in that kind of intervention.
Thank you, Minister. There's only a minute and a half left.
The Deputy really does have an awful lot of bogeymen in his head. Just perhaps dealing with the issue that the Deputy raised, I think it was the only one of substance. As part of Ireland's presidency of the EU Council 2013, a seminar was organised to discuss and examine how more effective cooperation and the building of partnerships, both across regional organisations and between these organisations and the United Nations, could be fostered. This was undertaken in order to enhance the effectiveness of UN-mandated peacekeeping operations, something I regard as of particular importance. A wide range of speakers. I don't know, does the Deputy want me to reply, or does he not, or I'm not quite sure. A wide range of speakers were invited to attend the seminar, including from the European Union, the United Nations, the African Union, NATO, and from academia. Close cooperation between NATO and the United Nations and its agencies is an important element in the development of an international comprehensive approach to crisis management and operations. It's important to note that the UN Security Council resolutions have provided the mandate for NATO's operations in the Western Balkans and in Afghanistan. Ireland participated in the NATO-led operations in the Western Balkans and in Afghanistan. More recently, NATO's operation to protect civilians in civilian-populated areas under threat of attack in Libya in 2011 was carried out in support of UN Security Council Resolution 1973. NATO has also provided support to UN-sponsored operations, including logistical assistance to the African Union's UN-endorsed peacekeeping operation in Darfur, Sudan and in Somalia. Support for UN disaster relief operations in Pakistan following the massive earthquake in 2005, and escorting merchant ships carrying World Food Programme's humanitarian supplies off the coast of Somalia. So it might come as some surprise to the Deputy that NATO is an organisation that's quite different now and has evolved from the one that he would have probably disliked because he would have favoured in those days the Soviet Union. Like the EU and the African Union, NATO shares a commitment with the United Nations to maintaining international peace and security. Two organisations have been cooperating in this area since the early 1990s, which the Deputy seems to have missed. In view of this, I decided to invite a speaker to provide the discussion with the view from NATO on how they actively enhance cooperation with the United Nations. Without the attendance of a representative from NATO, the debate and those attending would have missed an opportunity to hear first-hand the views of that organisation. I spoke at the opening of the seminar, and indeed I attended and listened to a number of sessions. And I just want to conclude, Caoileach, by saying I am of the view that the attendance of all the regional organisations, including NATO, was very worthwhile. Attendees heard the full range of views of the organisations concerned and how those organisations can enhance their cooperation in engaging in UN missions in the interests of both crisis, conflict, I should say, prevention, and in the area of peacekeeping and humanitarian assistance.
Members, I want to say that the debate has now come to a close. I want to thank the Minister and the members for their questions and answers in reverse order. I meant to say that. And to say thank you also to the staff here of the House. Tá an Dáil Athlo the Lahur Taresh de Majna Morach. The Dáil stands adjourned until 10:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. Thank you.